Ida Reyes was in her garden at 6 in the morning, doing what she did every Tuesday, cutting the dead heads off her dahlias so the living ones could breathe. She was 78 years old. Her knees hurt. Her coffee was getting cold on the fence post beside her. She did not care about either of these things. The dahlias were blooming red and orange, and one stubborn yellow one in the corner that she had been fighting with for 3 seasons. And this morning it had finally opened up the way she always knew it would. She was looking at that yellow dahlia when the mockingbird stopped singing. It went quiet the way birds go quiet when something big moves through the sky. Not a slow quiet, a sudden one, like a switch. Ida straightened up and looked. 3 ships came through the clouds. They were not human ships. They were long and gray, and shaped like something between a blade and a claw. And they dropped through the atmosphere without any sound at first, just the shadow they made sliding over the colony rooftops. Then the sound came, a low thrumming that got into the teeth. The EMP hit at 6:14. Every light in Elysian Reach went out at the same moment. The comm towers, the automated defense grid, the little weather station at the edge of the colony that old Marta Voss ran because it gave her something to do. All of it. Gone. The whole colony grid folded up like a napkin in 1 second flat. Ida stood in her garden and watched the ships land in the colony square. She picked up her coffee. It was cold now. She drank it anyway. The soldiers came out of the ships in rows. They were tall, 8 feet maybe more, and they wore pressure-rated armor the color of old rust. Their heads were narrow, and their eyes were compound and black, and they moved with the easy confidence of a species that had done this exact thing many times before and found it simple every time. They were called the Vorkai. Their empire was called the Compact. And Elysian Reach, population 4,200, average age 71. The retirement colony at the edge of human space had been rated a Tier 1 compliance target by their tactical computer. Tier 1 meant easy. Tier 1 meant fast. Tier 1 meant the whole operation was done and filed before the next rotation. The Vorkai commander was called a Thresh Captain. He stood in the middle of the colony square, in his rust-colored armor, and watched his soldiers fan out through the streets. And he felt, already, the particular boredom of a man doing something beneath his abilities. The colonists ran. Some of them screamed. A few of them fell over each other near the community center, which was expected behavior for a Tier 1 population. The Thresh Captain watched them scatter and made a note in his report. Then the door of the house at the edge of the square opened. A woman walked out. She was small and brown-skinned, and her gray hair was pulled back from her face with a clip that had a small plastic flower on it. She was wearing garden gloves. She was carrying a coffee cup. She walked to the edge of her front path, and she looked at the Thresh Captain. And then she looked at the 3 ships in the square, and then she looked back at him. She took a sip of her coffee. He stared at her. "You hit us on a Tuesday," she said. The Thresh Captain did not speak human languages directly. His translator ran a half-second behind. He heard the words. He processed them. He did not understand why they had been said or what they were meant to communicate. In 40 compliance actions across 6 star systems, no one had ever said anything like that to him. The woman looked at him for another moment. Her face was the face of someone doing a small calculation. Not a frightened calculation, a practical one, like she was measuring something. Then she turned and walked back inside and closed the door. The Thresh Captain turned to his second-in-command and issued the order to begin asset cataloging. It was the 4th step in the 6-step compliance doctrine. Steps 1 through 3 were complete. The EMP, the landing, the containment of civilian movement. Step 4 was inventory. Step 5 was the extraction of useful materials and the installation of a compact administrative unit. Step 6 was departure. Simple. Fast. Done. He did not think about the woman again. Inside the house, Ida Reyes set her coffee cup in the sink and walked to the kitchen cabinet above the refrigerator. She reached past the spare dish towels, past the box of her late husband's things she had never moved, past the tin of shortbread that had been empty for 2 years, but that she kept because he had given it to her on a Tuesday morning 30 years ago, in a different kitchen, on a different world, when they were both still young enough to think distance couldn't kill people. She opened the biscuit tin. Her old command codes were inside, rolled up in a piece of plastic, held with a rubber band that had gone brittle but hadn't snapped yet. She took them out and looked at them. Outside, the Vorkai were moving through the colony streets. She could hear the heavy mechanical rhythm of their footsteps through the walls. A child was crying somewhere on the next block. Someone was shouting in the direction of the water station. Ida stood at her kitchen counter and looked at her codes and listened. She had last used these in 2187. She had been standing on the bridge of a fleet carrier called the Ardent, with 3 enemy cruisers on her scope and 1,700 people on the decks below her, and approximately 90 seconds to decide something. She had decided. The 3 cruisers were no longer a problem after that. The paperwork had taken 6 months. She thought about that morning sometimes. Not the battle, not the decision, just the way the light had looked on the bridge. Cold and blue and very clear. The light in her kitchen now was worn. The yellow dahlia outside the window had finally opened up. She put the command codes in her cardigan pocket. She went to the window and looked out at the square. The Thresh captain was standing with his second-in-command, reviewing something on a screen. His soldiers moved in their patterns, precise, practiced, bored. They had done this many times. Ida had done it more. She turned from the window and went to her back room. There was a radio there, old, analog, nothing the EMP could touch. She sat down at the table and switched it to the frequency she and Walt had agreed on years ago. Half a joke, when they had first moved here and someone had said the words, retirement colony, and they had both smiled in the same way. She pressed the button. "Walt," she said, "you awake?" The radio crackled. "Been awake since the ships hit," Walt said. His voice was the same as always, low and dry as a creek bed in summer. "Figured you'd call." "Round everyone up," she said, "the ones we know." "Already started," he said. She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Outside, the Mockingbird was still silent. Walt Deschamps moved through the colony medical bay the way water moves through a familiar pipe. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Just a man who knew exactly where every corner was in the dark. The power was still out. He had 3 battery lanterns going and a 4th one on the floor near the supply cabinet, where it lit the most ground. He was 81 years old, and his knees had been complaining since the Second War, and they were complaining now. But knees were background noise. Knees were something you noted and then set aside, the way you noted weather. He did a head count from memory. Of the 4,200 residents of Elysian Reach, he knew 312 who had served in some branch of the human military. He knew 89 who had worked in intelligence or operations. He knew 44 who had done weapons work or engineering of some variety. He stopped counting at that point. Not because the numbers were small, because the numbers were not the problem. The problem was inventory. You could have all the people in the world and still lose if you had nothing to fight with. He went to find Priya. Priya Solano's workshop was behind her vegetable garden, past the tomato cages and the raised beds of sweet peppers, behind a door that she kept locked, not because she was secretive, but because the lock was what separated her from her neighbors, accidentally wandering in and touching things they should not touch. She was already there when Walt arrived. She had a lantern on the workbench, and she was moving through her shelves the way a musician moves through a song they have played 10,000 times. Not thinking about the notes, just playing. She was 74. She had the kind of energy that made people half her age feel tired watching her. Her hair was silver and cut short, and she was wearing the canvas apron she wore when she was gardening or building things that could hurt people. And tonight, the canvas apron meant only one of those things. Walt stood in the doorway and watched her work. She pulled things from shelves, atmospheric processor components, fertilizer compound in sealed bags, a coil of copper wire, mining equipment from the shelf above the window, medical-grade chemical bottles lined up in a row. Her hands knew what each thing was before she looked at the label. She set them on the bench in groups, and each group was a different thought, a different calculation. She was humming. Walt had known Priya for 11 years. He had never heard her hum when she was worried. She only hummed when she already knew the answer. "How bad is it?" he asked. "For them or for us?" she said, not turning around. "For them." She thought about it. She picked up a bottle of clear liquid, looked at it, set it in the third group. "I'd put my garden on it," she said. Walt had seen Priya's garden. He nodded. "I'll tell Ida." Eustace Fang had not said very much in 4 days. This was not unusual. Eustace did not say very much in general. He kept bees at the edge of the colony near the tree line, and he went to the community breakfast on Thursdays, and he played chess badly on purpose when he played against people he liked, so the games would last longer. He was 83. He had the face of a man who had seen a great number of things and made peace with most of them. He had spent the 2 days since the ships landed doing nothing but watching the Vorkai. He watched their patrol patterns, the exact routes they walked, the times they turned, the places where 2 soldiers were supposed to overlap, and the small gap where they didn't quite. He watched the way their antennae moved. The Vorkai communicated partly with their bodies, and their antennae told things their armor tried to hide. A slight droop when a soldier had been standing too long, a forward angle when they were alert, a flat stillness that meant something between discomfort and boredom. Most of the antennae he saw were flat. Bored soldiers were impatient soldiers. Impatient soldiers made the kind of mistakes that looked small until they weren't. On the morning of the 3rd day, Eustace walked to Ida's house and knocked on her back door. When she answered, he handed her a folded piece of paper and waited while she read it. 3 words. "They're already bored." Ida looked at the paper. She looked at him. "How long do we have before they stop being bored and start being rough?" she asked. 2 days, he said. "Maybe 3, if we give them something confusing to look at." "Can you give them something confusing to look at?" He considered this with the seriousness of a man being asked if he could breathe. "Yes," he said. She nodded. He nodded. He went back to his bees. They met that evening in the basement of the community theater. Ida, Walt, Priya, Eustace, and 9 others who had been called quietly through the analog network that Walt had set up in the first 6 hours. They sat on folding chairs in a room lit by 2 lanterns, and they laid out what they had. The meeting did not look like a military planning session. It looked like a group of old people arguing about wire gauges and chemical reaction rates, and whether the East Patrol route had a 14-minute gap or a 16-minute gap, which mattered because the difference between 14 and 16 minutes was the difference between getting out clean and not getting out at all. They argued about it for 20 minutes. It was 16. Priya had timed it twice. What came out of that meeting was not a military plan. Ida was clear about that. A military plan needed things they didn't have: numbers, weapons, a chain of command with the authority of something bigger behind it. What they were building was something else. An engineering problem, a psychological problem, a medical problem. 3 different problems running at the same time, and the Vorkai would have to solve all 3 simultaneously without knowing that any of them were connected. Ida had looked at their ships and their soldiers and their movements, and she knew they were good at war, the way a machine is good at the thing it was built for. But they had never fought people like this. They had never walked into a colony where the oldest woman on the block was a fleet admiral, and the cheerful lady with the vegetable garden was a weapons researcher who hummed when she already knew the answer. Their tactical computer had looked at Elysian Reach and seen a retirement colony. It had seen the age numbers, the small population, the lack of active military installation. It had not asked what those people had done before they came here. It had not thought to ask what it takes to make someone choose a quiet life at the edge of the galaxy. It takes surviving a great deal. It takes having already seen the worst of it and coming out the other side. The Vorkai computer had not been programmed to account for that. Ida looked around the room at the faces in the lantern light. Walt with his arms crossed and his quiet, steady eyes. Priya with a pencil behind her ear and 3 pages of notes covered in small, tight writing. Eustace, sitting at the edge of the group, watching the others the way he watched everything, the way someone watches a landscape they are already beginning to map. "We move at 0300, Ida said. No one argued. No one needed a speech. These were not people who needed speeches. They had all, at various points in their lives, stood in rooms like this one, and looked at problems like this one, and done what needed to be done. They filed out quietly, back into the dark colony, back toward the yellow lantern lights of the Vorkai patrols moving through the streets. Ida stayed behind for a moment. She sat alone in the empty basement and looked at her hands. Garden gloves on the table beside her, the plastic flower clip in her hair, the command codes rolled in her pocket. Her husband had asked her once, years before he died, if she ever missed it. The weight of it. She had told him no. She hadn't been lying. She hadn't been telling the complete truth either. She stood up, picked up her lantern, and went upstairs. 0300. They'd be ready. That was the point. At 3 in the morning, while the Vorkai East Patrol was in the 16-minute gap between overlaps, 2 people Ida trusted moved through the back streets with packs on their backs and did 3 things in specific locations that Priya had marked on a hand-drawn map. They did not shoot anything. They did not break anything. They placed small devices in 3 places, under the secondary power coupling of the nearest dropship, inside the ventilation housing of the Vorkai's portable command unit, and behind the water filtration relay they had taken over near the colony square. Then they came back. At 4:17 in the morning, all 3 devices activated. The dropship's power coupling shut down in a way that looked like a mechanical fault. The command unit's ventilation started cycling at the wrong intervals, which made the internal temperature irregular, which was not dangerous, but was deeply uncomfortable for a species that regulated body temperature through airflow. The water filtration relay simply stopped working. None of this destroyed anything. None of it killed anyone. It said something instead. It said, "We are here, we can reach you, and we are choosing not to hurt you yet." The Thresh captain read his damage reports at 5 in the morning, and felt for the first time since landing, something that was not boredom. Walt had set up the field hospital in the community theater 2 days after the landing. He had moved cots from the medical bay and carried his supply bags himself. 3 trips, his knees making their complaints the whole way. The theater had no windows at ground level, which meant lantern light didn't bleed outside, and it had 2 exits, which mattered for reasons he didn't have to explain to anyone who had ever done this kind of work. By the morning of the 6th day, he had treated 31 colonists for injuries from the landing and its aftermath, cuts and bruises from the panic in the streets, an older man who had fallen and broken his wrist, a woman with a bad reaction to stress who needed monitoring through the night. He also had 3 Vorkai soldiers. This had not been planned. Or rather, it had been planned, in the sense that Priya's atmospheric compound, the one she had deployed near the colony water station, had been designed to cause disorientation and nausea in Vorkai physiology. And the 3 soldiers who had walked through that area without their filter masks had gone down fast and hard in the middle of the street, and someone had to deal with them. Walt had dealt with them. He had 2 colony residents carry them into the theater on improvised stretchers. He had put them on cots. He had looked up Vorkai physiology in the old xenobiology files on his offline tablet. Priya had downloaded everything useful before the EMP hit, which was the kind of thing Priya thought to do, and he had treated them accordingly. Hydration, regulated temperature, rest. They were awake now, sitting up on their cots, watching him with their black compound eyes as he moved between patients. They had not tried to leave. They were not sure, Walt suspected, what was happening. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this particular situation. He set a cup of water on the small table beside the nearest one. The soldier looked at the cup, looked at him. Walt had nothing to say about it. He moved on. The Thresh captain's report to his superiors went out on the morning of the 6th day. It was not an easy report to write. He had been trained to write compliance reports, and compliance reports had a specific structure. Step 1 through 5. Timeline, asset count, estimated completion. He had been on this planet for 6 rotations. A Tier 1 compliance action took 18 hours. He wrote the report as accurately as he could, and sent it, and then he stood in the middle of the colony square in his rust-colored armor, and looked at the houses around him, and tried to understand what he was dealing with. The colonists moved around the edges of the square when they had to. They did not look at him with the expressions he expected. He knew what fear looked like. He had been looking at it across 6 star systems for his entire career. These people did not look afraid. Some of them looked annoyed. A few of them looked like people waiting for something they had already arranged. One old man with a white beard sat on his front step every morning with a cup of something hot and watched the patrols the way you watch traffic. Not nervous, just watching. The Thresh captain did not know that the old man was Eustace Fang, and that Eustace Fang had been counting and recording every single detail of every patrol for 6 days, and that the old man's stillness was not calm, it was work. The response to the report came from above the Thresh captain's level. It came from a war lector. War lectors were what the compact sent when compliance broke down. They were generals, essentially, officers who had handled large and difficult military engagements across the Empire's history. They did not normally involve themselves in Tier 1 actions. The fact that one was being assigned to Elysian Reach was, officially, a simple administrative escalation. Everyone involved understood that it was not. The battlecruiser arrived in orbit that afternoon. It was enormous. It made the 3 dropships in the colony square look like tools left out in a yard. Ida watched its orbit track on the salvage sensor that 2 of her people had repaired and hidden in the attic of the community center. She watched the numbers. She did the math on its weapon load, its troop capacity, its probable deployment timeline. She had seen ships like this before, from the other side of the engagement. The war lector's arrival meant the compact had officially reclassified Elysian Reach. Not a Tier 1 target anymore. The colony was now a Tier 3 resistance target. A threat. Ida looked at the orbit track and felt something warm move through her chest. Not fear, not pride exactly. Something older than either. There it is, she said quietly. She had been waiting for them to take this seriously. You could not win a fight the other side wasn't treating as a fight. Now they were paying attention. Now the real work could start. Obed Williams had been an infantry sergeant for 22 years before he retired to Elysian Reach and took up fishing. He was 84. He had been one of the people Ida sent out on Phase 1. And he had been coming back through the east side of the colony when a Vorkai soldier on an unscheduled patrol had rounded a corner, and the encounter had been brief and physical, and Obed had walked away from it, and the Vorkai soldier had not. But Obed had taken shrapnel from the soldier's equipment pack when it hit the ground, and the shrapnel had gone into his side. He had not said anything about it to anyone for 3 hours, because there was work to finish. When Walt found him, he had already lost more blood than the situation could forgive. Walt worked on him in the theater with the lanterns burning, and the 3 Vorkai soldiers watching from their cots in the corner. And he worked well, and he worked long, and he did everything he had learned to do in 3 wars across 30 years of following people into places where they got hurt. It wasn't enough. Obed knew before Walt did. He had that particular stillness that Walt recognized. The quieting of a person who has stopped spending energy on the future. "There's a beach," Obed said at some point in the night. "Where?" Walt said. He was still working. "Pacific. Real one. I keep meaning to go back." "You'll go," Walt said. Obed made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been something else. They stayed like that through the quiet part of the night. Walt did not look away. The lanterns burned low. Outside the theater, the Vorkai patrols moved through their routes, 16-minute gap on the east side, and the colony breathed in the dark. Obed died at 4:11 in the morning. Walt sat with him for 60 seconds. He counted. Then he stood up and washed his hands in the basin by the wall, and went to check on the woman with the stress reaction who needed monitoring. The 3 Vorkai soldiers watched him cross the room. The war lector's name was a sound that human mouths could not make correctly, so Ida, in her notes, called him the General. He was good at his job. She could see that from the orbit track alone. The way he positioned the cruiser told her things about how he thought. The angle of cover, the quick response deployment range, the kill zone he had set up around the colony's communication radius. He had done this before. He was experienced, careful, and completely confident. He had never fought people like hers. That was not arrogance on Ida's part, it was arithmetic. The Vorkai Compact had been expanding for 200 years. In 200 years, they had never walked into a retirement colony. They had never needed a doctrine for it. Their tactical computer's entire model of resistance was built on younger populations, soldiers with careers ahead of them, civilians with families to protect, governments with economies to lose. The general's playbook was built for people who had something to gain by surrendering. Every person in Elysian Reach had already lived their lives. They had already raised children and buried partners and survived the things that were supposed to break them and come out the other side. They had already given the best decades of their bodies to institutions that had chewed through them and moved on. You could not threaten people who had already paid every bill they owed. You could not intimidate them. You could not wear them down. The general did not know this yet. He was about to find out. Eustace had been running his operation for 6 days before the cruiser arrived, and he did not stop when it did. The thing about psychological operations, the real ones, not the movie version, was that they were slow. They were not explosions. They were not dramatic confrontations. They were water on stone. Small things, repeated in the right places, over time, until the stone was not the same stone anymore. He had started by feeding the Vorkai ground forces incorrect information through their own intercepted communication channels. Nothing dramatic. A patrol report that contradicted another patrol report. A maintenance log with a small error in the timeline. An equipment status update that didn't match what the soldiers in the field were seeing with their own eyes. None of these things were alarming on their own. But they accumulated. By the 5th day, the ground forces were spending part of every briefing trying to figure out which information was correct. By the 6th day, 2 patrol units had stopped fully trusting their command updates and were doing their own verification checks, which took time, which created gaps in coverage, which Priya's people used. On the 7th day, Eustace added the 2nd layer. He manufactured evidence, careful, slow, routed through 3 different channels, that the war lector's reinforcement timeline had been changed without informing the ground forces. He did not make it obvious. He made it the kind of thing you had to look for, the kind of thing that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee. Within 18 hours, the Thresh captain had filed a report to his superiors asking for clarification on the reinforcement schedule. The war lector, who had not changed the reinforcement schedule, did not understand why he was being asked about it. The 3rd layer was the simplest one. Eustace planted through 3 separate channels a suggestion, not a statement, a suggestion, the kind that lands in a briefing like a rumor and spreads the way rumors spread when people are already anxious. The suggestion was that there was a second human military presence in the system, not a colony, not retirees, a military presence, unregistered, operating dark. There wasn't. But the Vorkai didn't know that, and the war lector now had to spend resources confirming the negative, which meant resources not being spent on other things, which meant gaps. Eustace sat on his front step on the morning of the 8th day, and drank his tea, and watched the patrols with the same flat expression he always had. And inside his head, he was 3 moves ahead of everyone in the square. Priya's second set of devices went in on the night of the 8th day. She had been building them in her workshop for the past 4 days, with the focused happiness of someone doing exactly the work they were built to do. She hummed the whole time. She cross-referenced her yield estimates twice and then trusted them, because she had been calculating yields since before some of the Vorkai soldiers were born. The devices were not weapons. She wanted to be precise about this when she explained them to Ida. "They are very loud announcements," she said. "What do they announce?" Ida asked. "That we know where everything is," Priya said, "and that we could do much worse, and that we are choosing not to." The devices went into 3 new locations that night. One near the cruiser's secondary landing position, which the general had never used but had logged as a contingency. One inside the shielding housing of the ground force's primary weapons cache. One in the ventilation channel of the structure the Vorkai had turned into their administrative center. All 3 activated at 4 in the morning. None of them did any damage. They made a sound, and they left a mark, and the mark in each case was in a place that was supposed to be secure, the place that was supposed to be unreachable. The War Lector woke to 3 damage reports, none of them serious, all of them in locations that should have been impossible to access. He called an emergency briefing. In the briefing, 2 patrol unit commanders contradicted each other about what had happened on the east side of the colony the night before. The Thresh captain raised the question of the reinforcement schedule. Someone mentioned the second military presence in the system, framed carefully as unconfirmed intelligence, the most dangerous kind. The general listened to all of this. He was a good officer. Ida had known that from his orbit pattern. Good officers knew when the ground had shifted under them. They knew the feeling. He had that feeling now, and the measure of how good he was would be whether he admitted it or whether he pushed harder. He pushed harder. He ordered a full lockdown of the colony, doubled the patrols, restricted all colonist movement. Eustace heard about the lockdown order and wrote 4 words on a piece of paper and brought it to Ida. "He's getting scared now." Ida read it. She looked at Eustace. "Good scared or bad scared?" she asked. Good scared meant withdrawal. Bad scared meant he would hurt someone. Eustace thought about it. He had spent 40 years learning the difference. "Good scared," he said. "He's a soldier. He'll do the math." That evening, Ida and Eustace sat on her back porch. The Vorkai running lights moved in orbit above them, slow and steady as a second moon. The air was cool. The beehives at the edge of the colony were just audible, a low warm hum that had been there every evening since Eustace moved in, 8 years ago, and that Ida had come to think of as part of the sound of this place, the same way the mockingbird was part of the sound of this place. She had not heard the mockingbird since the ships landed. She poured coffee. Eustace took his without anything in it, the same as always. They sat. "How long?" she asked. He did the same calculation she had already done, but slower, more carefully, the way he did everything. "They'll ask for terms by morning," he said. She nodded, he nodded. They drank their coffee and listened to the bees. After a while she said, "You miss it?" He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that meant he was actually thinking about it, not just pausing. "Some days," he said, "not today." She understood that. She did not ask him to explain it. At 3:17 in the morning, a communication came through the restored emergency channel to Elysian Reach. It was addressed to whoever was in command of the colony's resistance operations. Ida was in her kitchen when the alert came. She sat down at the table and looked at the message header for a moment. Then she typed back, "1 moment, I was asleep." She had not been asleep. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with her cold coffee and her command codes, and the yellow dahlia in the window, waiting for exactly this. She let 4 minutes pass. Then she opened the channel and began to talk. Ida did not ask for much. She asked for the 3 Vorkai soldiers in Walt's theater to be returned without consequence to their unit. She asked for a full withdrawal of all ground forces within 6 hours. She asked for the ships to leave the colony square and depart the system within 12. She asked for a formal acknowledgement, transmitted on a recorded channel, that Elysian Reach had not been subdued. The war lector took 40 minutes to respond. Then he agreed. The Thresh Captain's soldiers began pulling back at 5 in the morning. They moved in their precise rows, the way they had moved when they arrived, but the quality of the movement was different. Ida watched from her front path, garden gloves on, coffee in hand, and she could see it. The mechanical confidence was gone. They were still disciplined, they were still professional, but they were moving the way soldiers move when they are glad to be leaving somewhere. The last Vorkai soldier boarded the last dropship at 10:40 in the morning. The ships lifted. Ida watched them go until the sound faded and the sky was just sky again. The amber light of Kepler 442b's morning stretching over the colony rooftops. And somewhere in the tree line at the edge of the settlement, something moved in the branches. Then the mockingbird sang. It ran through its whole catalog, the same as always. Engine sounds and door hinges, and other birds and things it had heard that had no names. And then, near the end, something new. A low mechanical thrum, deep and rhythmic, the sound of dropship engines that the bird had heard 9 days ago and filed away, and was now folding into the song as if it had always been there. Ida listened. She finished her coffee. The colony took 3 weeks to put itself back together properly. Power was restored in the first 2 days. The comm towers took longer. Priya's workshop became, briefly, the most important building in Elysian Reach, because she had parts that other people needed, and she shared them with the same cheerful efficiency she brought to everything else. Walt ran his theater hospital for another week before the medical bay was functional again. He discharged his last patient on a Wednesday morning, and spent the afternoon cleaning and returning the folding chairs to the storage room in the back. He worked alone. The theater was quiet. The lanterns were put away, and the regular lights were on, and it looked again like a place where people came to watch performances. He stood in the middle of it for a moment before he left. Then he went home and slept for 14 hours, which was not something he had done since the Second War. The Commonwealth delegation arrived on a Thursday. There were 6 of them. They came in a small diplomatic shuttle that landed neatly in the colony square, in the same spot where the Vorkai dropships had sat for 9 days. The lead envoy was a woman named Dessa Cole. She was 34 years old. She had a decorated service record, a fast mind, and a briefing packet that was 40 pages long. She had been sent because 4 separate intelligence services had flagged the Elysian Reach engagement, and none of them could make sense of what had happened there. She sat across from Ida Reyes at the kitchen table and opened her packet. She had questions about doctrine. She asked about the command structure, the tactical framework, the communication protocols. She asked how the EMP countermeasures had been prepared in advance. She asked about the PSYOPS operation and who had run it and what training background they had come from. Ida listened to each question carefully. She answered some of them. She said that the colony's analog radio network had been set up years ago as a general emergency measure. She said that the people who had helped were residents who had various backgrounds and had applied their knowledge as it seemed useful. She said that no formal command structure had been established because none had been necessary. Dessa Cole wrote things in her notebook and looked up. "That's not an answer," she said, with a kind of respectful directness that Ida appreciated. "It's the honest one," Ida said. "Help me understand then," Dessa said. "What was this, if it wasn't a military operation?" Ida looked out the window. The yellow dahlia was in the corner of the garden, open and steady in the morning light. The mockingbird was somewhere in the colony doing its catalog. "It wasn't a framework," she said. "Then what was it?" Ida thought about Walt washing his hands at 4 in the morning and going back to work. She thought about Priya humming over her workbench. She thought about Eustace sitting on his front step, watching, learning the shape of something he already knew how to break. She thought about Obed and the Pacific beach and the long quiet night in the theater. "It was Tuesday," she said, We weren't busy. Dessa Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrote something in her notebook and did not read it back aloud. The after-action report that Dessa filed with the Commonwealth ran to 60 pages. The recommendation at the end of it had 3 parts. First, that 16 residents of Elysian Reach be formally recognized for their actions during the occupation. Second, that the colony be reclassified from an undefended civilian settlement to a Tier 5 strategic asset. Third, and most quietly, that the Commonwealth's own retirement settlement program be reviewed, because it had been, the report noted, miscategorizing its population's capabilities for 30 years. The War Lector's own report was classified immediately upon receipt. It would stay classified for 11 years, when it was finally leaked by a junior compact records officer who found it while cataloging old files and could not believe what he was reading. It ran to 14 pages on the engagement alone. 9 of those pages were under the heading that translated roughly as unexplained tactical anomalies. The compact updated its invasion doctrine within the year. The new version added a flag. It was automatically attached to any human colony whose median resident age was above 65. The flag was short. It translated imperfectly but adequately as prior service population detected, do not engage, seek alternate target. It was the only flag in 200 years of compact doctrine that had been added because of a defeat, not a victory. It was the only defeat in the entire history of the compact's expansion that had been carried out without a single military asset in play. Ida planted new dahlias in the week after the delegation left. She bought the bulbs from old Henrik, 2 plots down, who grew them in 4 colors and was insufferable about it in the way that people who know they are good at something are allowed to be. She planted them in the corner near the fence where the soil was richest, and she mixed in the compost she had been building since spring, and she packed the earth around each bulb with her hands. The mockingbird landed on the fence post while she worked and ran through its song. The new part was near the end, the way it always put new things near the end while it was still deciding whether they belonged. The dropship thrum, low and rhythmic, and then past it, through it, back to the morning things, wind sounds, sparrow calls, the distant particular creak of Eustace's beehive in a breeze. Ida listened. She took off her gloves and picked up her coffee from the fence post and stood there for a while in the amber morning light with the cup warm in her hands. The biscuit tin was back on its shelf in the kitchen cabinet, above the dish towels, above the empty shortbread box she had never thrown away. The command codes rolled up in their plastic sleeve, rubber bands still holding, same as they had held for 30 years. She had not opened it since Tuesday. She did not think she would need to again, but she would leave it there. She always left it there.